We've talked about most of this stuff before in different contexts, but today I thought it would be nice to put it together, and there is a reason for this. If you drive around Shelby, you'll notice churches of various denominations, just around right in a mile radius. Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Church of Christ, Church of the Nazarene, Missionary Baptist, Missionary Methodist, Free Will Baptist, Wesleyan, Pentecostal Holiness, just to name a few. It's sort of hard to make sense of all these different denominations. Today I thought it would be interesting to try to think about the issue of denominations. Now I'm going to start with a man named John Calvin. We've talked about him before. Virtually all denominations in the United States were influenced by him. He lived in the 1500s and he developed ideas about God that are still with us today. A lot of people have no idea that's where they originated from. Now Calvin had one overriding belief about God, and that is that all God cares about is bringing glory and honor to himself. That's all God cares about. He cares about nothing but making himself look glorious. And so God decided one day that in order to make himself look glorious, the best way he could do that would be to show justice and mercy. And so God created the world, and he put human beings in it, and he made all people sinners. But even though he made them sinners, he still made them responsible for it. And so God said everybody that sinned deserves to go to hell for all eternity. And since he made everybody sinners, everybody deserved to go to hell. So he showed his justice and mercy. He showed his justice by letting some go to hell like they deserved. He showed his mercy by sparing some and begrudgingly letting them enter heaven. So that was John Calvin's view of God. And in Calvin's view, God controls everything, every drop of rain that falls. That one drop that fell on your driveway wouldn't have been there if God hadn't sent it. But more important than that, God decides who goes to heaven and hell. And that decision was made before you were born. Now you were born as a sinner, rotten to the core. Not because of anything you did, but because that's the way God made you. And before you were born, God had already decided whether you'd go to heaven or hell. You had no say in that. You can see then that human beings are nothing but a tool by which God supposedly brings honor and glory upon himself. Now, although we might look at Calvin's stuff today and think, well, how in the world could people have ever accepted that stuff? Back when it came out, it was very attractive to people. And it eventually became the way most Christians in the West looked at God. It even had influence in Roman Catholicism. Calvinism became very popular in Western Europe. It also became very popular in England. The Church of England became Calvinist. They later rejected Calvinism, but they were Calvinists. At the time, the first settlers were coming to the United States, and so many of the first settlers that came to the United States were Calvinists. And so the Church of England was Calvinist. The early settlers to the United States were Calvinists. And so a lot of the people that came here were Calvinists, and that was really the first influence in religion in the United States, was Calvinist theology. Out of Calvinism came denominations such as the Presbyterians, the Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church, the United Church of Christ. Now, as time went on, a lot of people in England grew dissatisfied with the Church of England. There was many reasons for that, and different groups were dissatisfied about different things. But eventually what came to happen was that some of these groups began to pull out of the Church of England and make their own little groups, and that's what's called the English separatist movement. The leader of one of those was a man named John Smith, late 1500s, early 1600s. He didn't like the idea of a government-run church, and of course the Church of England was a government-run church. He believed the church should be independent of the government. He also didn't like all the rituals and pomp and circumstance found in the Church of England. He felt church services should be simple from the heart. His ideas were not popular at first, and he was eventually forced to leave England, and he ended up here in America. And at some point, Smith realized that baptism, as described in the New Testament, was completely different than it was practiced in most churches. Most churches were baptizing infants. There is no indication in the New Testament whatsoever that any of the early Christians baptized infants. The only baptisms we have reported are of adults. The only baptisms the New Testament describes are of adults who are baptized after they make the decision to believe in Jesus. And so Smith decided that if you wanted to follow the New Testament example, baptism should be done on adults after they make the decision to believe in Jesus. That's what's called believer baptism. Smith's ideas became influential, and eventually what we know as the Baptist denominations developed. There are a number of different Baptist denominations in the United States. We are probably most familiar with the Southern Baptist because that's the majority around here, but it's not the majority other places. There's National Baptist, American Baptist, all kinds of different Baptists. It's hard to make any general statement about what they believe, but in general they do believe in believer baptism. They believe in separation of church and state. They reject authority figures like popes, bishops, and presbyteries. They believe each local church should govern itself. And traditionally, Baptist churches have had simpler services without a lot of ritual. Now, while we might think that Baptist churches are always on the conservative side, that is not true. There are conservative Baptist denominations. There are also very liberal Baptist denominations. First Baptist here in Shelby is associated with what would be termed a liberal Baptist denomination. Now, surprisingly enough, for most of their history, Baptists were Calvinists. It was not until after the turn of the 20th century that most Baptists began rejecting Calvinism, and they began to believe that each individual had the opportunity to believe in Jesus and be saved. And that belief brings up another interesting person we've talked about before, John Wesley. He lived in the 1700s. He was the son of a priest in the Church of England, and he himself became a priest in the Church of England. He had in his mid-30s what he described as a religious awakening, and he became dissatisfied with the Church of England. He felt it was corrupt, and people were paying it no attention, and thus they were dying in their sins. So he began preaching, not in churches, but just outside, wherever he could. Wesley believed that all people have the opportunity to be saved, that God gives everybody the choice. He believes that God works in all people to lead them to Jesus, but that people make the decision in response to preaching. And thus Wesley's preaching was designed to make people take the step and commit to becoming a Christian. So he believed that although God's Spirit works trying to lead you, that it is the preacher in the final analysis who can cause you to take the lead and make the decision. His preaching was fiery and dramatic. It played on the emotions. It worked people up into frenzies that they passed out or had seizures. And he tried to do that because he felt that it was during such an emotional state that you could finally break down and make the commitment to become a Christian. And he also believed religion should be something that is experienced in worship, filled with the Spirit, as we would say. They clapped their hands. They shouted. They jumped around. These were ways that God allowed you to experience your faith. And Wesley also had the belief that if a person tried hard enough, with God's help, they could reach a point in their life where they very, 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 very seldom ever sin. And if they did sin, it would be a slip-up in a small, minor thing. If you worked hard at this, God would help you, and He can enable you. And He developed a method for doing it. A method so you could become holy. And notice those two terms, method and holy. Wesley's ideas came to this country where they were very popular. Preachers went around the more rural and sparsely populated areas and held open-air meetings and revival. There was an early circuit in northern Cleveland County in the 1700s. It stretched through northern Cleveland County and went up to Morgan. It was a Methodist circuit, one of the earliest ones before it was down here. They were in northern Cleveland. Now, from John Wesley came a variety of different denominations. What we know as Pentecostalism came from that. And Spirit-filled worship, Pentecostal, with gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues and prophecy and stuff like that. Holiness churches came from John Wesley. The holiness movement believed, remember, like Wesley believed that you could reach a state where you seldom sin. The holiness movement said there's two stages of becoming Christian. First stage is when you first believe in Jesus, and then after that, if you work toward it, you would reach the state of holiness where you do not sin. You do not ever commit a voluntary sin. It would only be a minor slip-up. What we called back in the 1970s the charismatic movement came out of John Wesley, although it did not actually begin in denominations that were influenced by him. It was characterized with spirit-filled worship like Pentecostalism, speaking in tongues, faith healing, emotional responses. That type of thinking was associated with John Wesley. Methodist churches came out of John Wesley. John Wesley lived according to a method. He met every morning with a group for Bible study. He prayed every hour. He kept a journal every hour on which he graded himself on a scale of 1 to 9 of how good a Christian he had been in that previous hour. This was his method for living a Christian life, and that's where the term Methodist came from. That's doubtful that very many Methodists ever followed John Wesley's method, but that's where the name came from. Now it's interesting that John Wesley never really broke with the Church of England, although he did see the need for fiery and emotional preaching. He also saw the need for a ritualistic, structured service like you found there. And that's why Methodists, once they quit just meeting in brush arbors, sort of had more sedate services than some of the other Christians. As they became established in the church buildings, they lost some of the fieriness and became more on the sedate side. Now, what binds all these churches together that came out of John Wesley was that they rejected Calvinism. That's basically where Wesleyanism came from. They rejected Calvinism. They believed that God works in everyone, wanting them to be saved. Now you can see how Baptist and Methodist eventually basically morphed into the same thing. In general, the only difference in a Baptist and Methodist is that the Methodists used to have a more structured service and they baptized infants, whereas Baptist churches tended to be more informal and they only baptized adult believers. The reason all that happened is that all that melded into one is because the original issues that created all these denominations no longer were issues anymore. Those questions that created all these little denominations People don't talk about that stuff anymore. Nobody even cares about it. And nobody probably can even tell you in those churches today what the issues were. And plus, the denominations that came out of all those things have largely left behind the original beliefs of their founders. I'm sure John Wesley would recognize nothing in modern Methodist churches of his stuff. I'm sure John Calvin would recognize nothing in the Presbyterian Church today of his stuff. Now, the result is that within each denomination, there is no unifying factor. It's just whether you like that church or not. Or in the case of some people I know, if you like the preacher. You know, they go to one church for a while, then get another preacher. I don't like that preacher, so they go somewhere else. You know, when I was in seminary, somebody asked me, what do Presbyterians believe? And my response was, which one? So that's more or less the way it is. It's hard to pin down what anybody believes this day and time. There's actually not much difference in belief among the main denominations today. It's just differences in style. Differences in style. Now, all the denominations today are declining. If you look at it in terms of raw numbers, it's bad. But if you look at it in terms of percentage of the population, their decline has been more like on the order of 90% in percentage of population. In terms of percentage of population, they are becoming irrelevant. And by far, most people don't identify with any of them. Now, today we see more and more churches that are not part of any denomination like this one. And even some that are parts of denominations are dropping their denominational name out. The two most trendy Baptist churches in Shelby today don't have Baptist anywhere in their name. They are in fact Baptist, but it's not in the name. It's thought to be a turnoff if you put that in there. More and more people today don't have any particular attachment to any certain denomination. And more people are saying that denominations are not for them. That's how the Chapel of Christ started. I had been Presbyterian, then I became Episcopalian, and then I decided to go to seminary. I chose to go to a Presbyterian seminary. It soon became apparent to both Wanda and me that we did not fit in the Presbyterian denomination. Now, like most denominations, the Presbyterian denomination had changed a lot, and it was a lot different than it had been years earlier when I was a part of a Presbyterian church. We thought about maybe moving to another denomination, but frankly, we realized we didn't belong in any of them. But we realized that there was nowhere we wanted to go. And we realized a lot of other people felt the same as we did. After a lot of soul searching, we decided to start a church that would be independent of any denomination. Our vision was something different than a regular church, something simple, something where people from a variety of religious backgrounds could come and feel comfortable. We both liked the Episcopal service, the quietness and reverence of it, and the structure of it. And so we decided that we would have a quiet and reverent structured service. We had a number of ideas about things we wanted to do and also things we did not want to do. And we realized we could not do that within a denomination. The only way we could do it was if we were independent. And so the idea for the Chapel of Christ was born. One of the first things that we decided was that we would never, ever try to own a building. It had seemed to us in some of the churches we had gone to in the past that the buildings consumed too much time, too much resource, and the building was what it was all about. There was always something that needed to be repaired, and there was always the need to build another one. And we always had to ask for money, more and more money for the building. And so we decided we would never own a building. And that led to yet another thing. We decided that early on that we would never beg for money. We had been in churches that constantly begged for money. We've been in some churches before that there were 4 or 5 things on any given Sunday that they wanted you to donate to. And it didn't matter how much money people gave. We had people over there in Redeemer that gave millions, hundreds of thousands, yet they never had enough. And so we decided we would never beg for money. We decided we'd put an offering box at the back. People could give if they wanted to. We'd operate on whatever people give, and we'd never ask for more. And we never had. But you know, all that meant sacrifices on our part. We don't have a salary of $75,000 a year. Don't have a retirement plan that's going to pay me $2,200 a month for the rest of my life. All that meant that if we were actually going to start this church, we'd have to find a place to rent, and it would have to be at a reasonable price. I had no idea. Wanda said the only place she could think of would be in this place. I had never been in here before she had. I did not know who owned this. I did not know who owned the funeral home. So I just called the funeral home number. You got an answering service. She said, I haven't called. So I talked to Bill and Robin Burton on the phone. I did not know them. They did not know either one of us. They said they'd think about it and get back to us. Weeks and weeks passed, and we heard nothing from them. And we assumed they weren't going to let us in here. Then all of a sudden the phone rang one day and they wanted us to come over here. So we came over here and met with them. It's the first time I'd ever been in here. They agreed to let us use it for $300. That was much less than we thought. It's more than that now, but that's what it was. And so on January 22nd, 2012, we had our first sermon. If it had not been for Bill and Robin Burton allowing us to use this space and allowing us to use it at such a reasonable cost, this would not have ever happened. Chapel of Christ would never have existed, at least not as Robin Burton died this past week. Since she was such an integral part of this church, I thought it only fitting that her part in this be recognized. If it had not been for Bill and Robin Burton, we wouldn't be here today. In the 12-plus year history of the Chapel of Christ would not exist. They were very gracious to us during the 10 years that they owned the building that we were here. If not for Robin and Bill Burton, none of this would have been possible. I do not know the reason they allowed us to be in here. It certainly wasn't for the money, because they didn't get enough money out of us to really matter. It must have been that they saw some value. So today I would like for us to remember and give thanks for Robin Taylor Burton. She was 67 years old.